Hello everyone. In today's session, we will see about authentication in Rest Assured. But before that, let's understand what is authentication. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of the user or client who is trying to access the API. Authentication means verification of identity of the user or client who is trying to access the API. So normally it works like this. So whenever the client, now client means it can be a postman, a rest assured, or any application that sends request to server. So before sending the request, server will verify whether that specific client is authenticated user or not. Now it will identify on the basis of credentials like username and password, that is called as a basic authentication. It can also identify on the basis of API key or token that will verify the authenticity of that user or that client. So if that user is authenticated, it will allow to send the request and it will send the response. But if that user is not authenticated, or let's say username and password is incorrect, then it will not send the response correctly because that user is not authenticated user. So server verifies those credentials, and if valid, the user will be considered as authenticated. So that is a high level concept of authentication. Now there is one more term called as a authorization. Now there is a difference between authentication and authorization. So authentication means verifying the identity of the user. So if the user enters correct username and correct password, then we provide authenticity to that user. That means that is authenticated user. But what is authorization? Authorization is the process of verifying what actions or resources an authenticated user is allowed to access. So authorization comes into the picture after authentication. So once user is authenticated, that means user is valid user. But after authentication, the system will check if that specific user is having certain roles or permissions, what resources should be allowed to be accessed by that user, which resources need to be restricted for that user, or let's say for that specific rules. That comes under authorization. So a user can be an authenticated user, but still that user might be restricted to certain resources to access. A simple example will be, let's say, admin user or regular user. Now on our server, consider one resource which is accessible for admins, but that should not be accessible to regular users. Now admin or regular user both are authenticated user. They will be able to authenticate, but when it comes to accessing some certain resources, if admin try to access those, he will be able to access those. But if regular user try to access those resources, regular user will get some error. Regular users will not be able to access those resources because they are not authorized user. So that is the fundamental difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication means verifying the identity, whether it is correct user or not. But authorization means verifying the permissions and roles, etc. And according to that, it will restrict or allow access based on rules. Normally in API testing, we validate both the things. We validate authentication as well. We also validate authorization as well. For example, for authentication, we check whether valid credentials are giving success 200 response or not. Invalid credentials will give you 401 unauthorized error. And for authorization, we check for valid role. Let's say 200 OK if the user is authorized, or it will give you 403 forbidden if user is invalid, or let's say it is not authorized to access that resource. So on high level, what are the differences between authentication and authorization? So authentication will verify who the user is. Authorization will verify what the user can access. Authentication happens first and then we will check for authorization. Authentication uses username, password, API key, or any type of tokens. Those are used for authentication purpose. Whereas for authorization, user roles, policies, permissions are considered. Simple example are when the user login with the token that comes under authentication, and access control to different resources comes under authorization. What is the error code we get for authentication? 401 unauthorized. If username or password is incorrect, and if you are hitting the API, you will get unauthorized 401 error for authentication. And for authorization, it will be 403 forbidden, because you are not allowed to access certain resource. In that case, you will get 403 forbidden error. This is the concept of authentication and authorization. Now, when we are using rest assured, there are sometimes we might get an API which needs authentication. In rest assured, there are several types of authentication mechanisms are supported. Test secure REST APIs. What are the different ways of authentication mechanism? For example, basic authentication, digest authentication, preemptive basic authentication, OAuth 1.0, OAuth 2.0. So OAuth 1.0 is now deprecated and it is not mostly used. Nowadays, most of the applications uses OAuth 2.0, that is bearer token approach. And there can be a custom authentication also used. For example, API keys or tokens in the header. So we will see some practical examples as well. It's difficult to get all the APIs which performs all different type of authentications, but we will see whatever are available. We will try to use and demonstrate the examples. In today's session, we will mainly focus on basic authentication, digest authentication, and preemptive basic authentication. And in next session, we will see OAuth and custom authentication. So first, let's see example of basic authentication. Now, I will use one of the API which is provided by Postman tool. So if you have Postman tool, in that you will get this API collection. For basic authentication, now this is the endpoint. So when you try to hit this endpoint request, this is a GET request. It needs basic authentication. So if you see, authentication type is basic authentication. In this, you have to pass username and password. Username is Postman and password is password. We have to configure this username and password inside the authorization, and then only we will get success response. So if I hit the request now, if you see, it is giving me response code of 200, and in response we are getting this body, that is authenticated true. So this is how basic authentication works in API. If you provide incorrect password, it will give you unauthorized error with 401 error code, because we are not giving the correct password now. That's why it is giving you unauthorized error. And when you enter the correct password, in basic authentication, we have to provide username and password. And if you hit the endpoint now, it will give you correct response. That means these credentials are correct and user is authenticated user. Now this we have completed via using Postman. Now same API, let's see by using rest assured how we can perform this action. So let's go to Eclipse. Let's create a new class. I am naming it as auth demo. Let's create this new class. Let's import some of the static packages of rest assured. So I am importing the static packages which we require for rest assured. Control C and let's paste it in our class. After that, let's create one method. I am naming it as test basic auth demo. Let's provide at the rate test annotation and let's import testng from testng annotations. Now our regular syntax of given when section and dot then section. Now we have to use this API. So this is a GET request in which we have to hit this URL along with this basic authentication of this username and password. So first step is whenever we have to use any authentication in APIs, we have to provide that in given section. So in given section, we have to use dot auth method, dot auth, and when you provide dot, you will see all the different type of authentication mechanisms. For example, basic authentication, OAuth, digest authentication, preemptive authentication. So all the different type of authentication mechanism you will see inside this method, that is auth. So first we are going to see basic authentication. So we have to select the basic one. In this we have to pass two parameters. First name is username and then you have to pass the password. So what is the username and password? Postman is the username, password is password. So we have to pass that here. So first let's pass the username and password. After that, we have to provide the endpoint inside the when section. That is the type of request. So this is a GET request. In this, we have to provide this URL which we need to hit. And after hitting this request, we will get the response like this. So 200 is the status code and body will contain authenticated as true. So we can validate that in then section. Dot status code should be 200 and inside the body we can use authenticated and that value coming as true. So if you see authenticated value is coming as true, so that we can validate inside then section. That's it. So now what this method will do, this is a basic authentication demo. So I'm just giving priority equal to 1. In given section we are using dot auth method, dot basic authentication. We have to pass the username and password and then we are using when section. In that we are hitting the endpoint and in then section we are validating it. given, when, and then section. We have to use equal to, it should be true. So let's save this and let's execute this. So let's run as test-ng test. So it should pass the test case because we will get the correct response with correct authentication. So if you see test case is passed, that means it is able to authenticate the user with this username and password. Then it is hitting this endpoint URL. It is getting the response and it is verifying status code is 200 and authenticated body is true. So that is verifying this authenticated true as well. So that is the first example of basic authentication demo. Now the Postman API which we are using, it supports this mechanism. That's why it is giving you success. So whenever you are working on any project, you will get API contract, you will get some type of documentations of those API testing in which it will be mentioned what type of authentication mechanism it supports. So we have to first understand which type of authentication mechanism it supports, and accordingly we have to test those scenarios. Now let's see another scenario, that is for digest type. So digest authentication. Now basic authentication, digest authentication, and preemptive authentication, all the three type of authentication uses username and password only, but their internal mechanism is different. So even though they are using username and password, their internal algorithm to validate is different. But as a user or as a tester, we don't have to understand in details, but just we should understand which technique we have to use every time depending on the requirement. So for basic authentication, you have to pass username and password here for authentication. Now let's see for digest one. So control C, I am just copying the same method here. Let's paste it. I'm creating a new method now, test digest auth demo. Now in this, Postman has one more API, that is this one. So this is the endpoint. Here also we have to pass username and password, but authentication type is digest auth. And if you hit this request, it will give you again the similar response, authenticated true, 200 OK. Authentication type is digest auth, and this is the URL. So now let's try to automate that. So again, test digest auth demo. Given section we have to use dot auth instead of basic. Now we have to use dot digest. So here we have to use now dot digest. Again we have to pass the username and password. What is the endpoint that we have to pass here? This is the endpoint. I am just copying this. Let's pass this URL in this get section. Status code which will come in the response is 200, and again body will contain authenticated as true. So that is the same thing we are validating here. We just change dot auth dot digest and the endpoint is changed now. So this is a second priority, let's say, and let's execute both the test cases now. So this time both the test cases should pass. So first one is for basic authentication and second is for digest authentication. So both the test cases got passed. Both the techniques are using username and password, but internally their algorithm is different. Now let's see one more type of authentication, that is preemptive authentication. So I will just again copy this one. Let's copy the second method again and let's paste it here. Let's name it as test preemptive authentication demo. In preemptive authentication, now I will just use the same endpoint and same username and password because that endpoint and API supports that. So I will just use the same one. So we are not going to change this. Only thing we will change is here. So auth dot, instead of digest, what we have to do here is auth dot preemptive method dot basic. So we have to use dot preemptive dot basic, and here we have to pass username, that is postman, and password which we need, that is password. That's it. So it will hit this endpoint. It will use preemptive authentication this time, which also again uses username and password. It will verify the status code is 200 in the response, and authenticated should come as true. Now let's give it priority equals to 3. So these are the three different type of authentication methods which we have created. Now let's execute this one also. So all the three test cases should be passed now. So all the three test cases are getting executed. Something is breaking. Let's see. Okay, so this specific API is not supporting, so we have to use this API. So in the first test case, this is the URL which we have to use, Control C, and let's use it here. So this endpoint supports basic authentication as well as preemptive basic authentication. So let's save this and let's execute this. Run as testng test. Now this time all the three test cases should pass. If you see, all the three test cases got passed. Means all the three test cases are using authentication. So first we have seen the basic authentication, in which we have to use dot auth dot basic, and we have to pass the username and password. In test digest auth demo, we have used digest authentication mechanism. Again, it uses the username and password only. This is the endpoint which we have used. It gives the similar response. And third one is preemptive authentication. So it combines basic and digest authentication, and we have to use dot preemptive dot basic. So this is again uses the username and password, but all the three are having different mechanism. So they basically have different algorithm for authentication mechanism. But in detail, we don't have to understand that. Just understand the way how we have to use the authentication in rest assured. So if you are using basic authentication, we have to simply pass dot auth dot basic username and password. If you are using digest authentication, then you have to use dot auth dot digest, and we have to pass the username and password. And if your API supports preemptive authentication, then you have to use like this dot preemptive dot basic. In that you have to pass password and username, and then you will be able to authenticate with those APIs. So this is a simple examples of three types which we have seen. So what we have seen so far is basic authentication, digest authentication, and preemptive basic authentication. So in the next session, we will see about OAuth 1.0, OAuth 2.0 bearer token approach, and custom authentication mechanism. So let's meet in our next session. Thanks for watching this video.